So I've talked a bit about how the effects of the rise of sexual freedom and the sexual revolution are somewhat contradictory for same-sex relations. And there's a very similar story to be told about its effects on women. On the one hand, the idea that sexual freedom is as natural and desirable for women as for men was born in the 18th century. Many of you will recognize who that is, Mary Wollstonecraft. She is one of the most prominent early exponents of free love. She, together with her lover, William Godwin, who in 1793 wrote in the first edition of his Political Justice that the institution of marriage is a system of fraud. And this view comes to be quite prominent in radical circles after 1800. By the 1820s, the leading Republican Richard Carlile, who also puts his views into practice with the feminist Eliza Sharples, writes a series of best-selling publications advocating free love. As he wrote, "There is nothing in sexual intercourse that has any relation to morals more than in eating or in drinking together. A true moralist sees no crime in what is natural and will never denounce an intercourse between the sexes where no violence nor any kind of injury is inflicted. Sex is the very source of human happiness and essential alike to health, beauty, and sweetness of temper." We can trace that kind of thinking all the way through the 19th and into the 20th centuries, but it's always a minority view. The main effect of the sexual revolution for women was to establish a new commonplace that men were naturally, inevitably promiscuous, and that women were usually their sexual victims, that women, in fact, were inherently chaste and asexual. This is a picture illustrating Samuel Richardson's great novel Clarissa, in which this attitude is taken to extremes. A very influential fiction, and one of the ways in which these ideas spread in the 18th century is through these new forms of communication like the novel. Now, the effects of this new conception of female sexuality as essentially dormant can be seen everywhere in 18th and 19th and 20th century culture. It is, for example, one of the foundations of modern feminism, from Mary Astle to Mary Wollstonecraft to Josephine Butler into the 20th century. Most early feminists presumed that women were morally superior to men, and the epitome of that was the fact that they were more chaste than men. What was needed in the world, as Christabel Pankhurst put it in her great slogan of 1913, was votes for women and chastity for men. Another effect of this new conception was a huge shift in attitudes towards prostitutes, towards fallen women as essentially victims of male seduction and social and economic circumstances. And so from the middle of the 18th century onwards, huge efforts are poured into the rehabilitation and rescue of women from white slavery. This is from some early propaganda of the first institution to be founded in the English-speaking world for this purpose, the Magdalen House in London. In the background, you see a ragged whore. In the foreground, you see a woman in the uniform of the Magdalen House who's been transformed from that into a respectable young person. So the movement to rescue prostitutes is one of the most phenomenal successes in terms of public interest and public engagement of the philanthropic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. This is a picture of the interior of the Magdalen House's chapel. Here are the fashionable public come to show their benevolence and give their donations, and there, hidden behind a screen, but not hidden too much, are the penitent women themselves, whom everyone is keen to catch sight of. So there are many effects of the first sexual revolution on attitudes to female sexuality and on social policy and on feminism. But the most important effect, the main effect, is to place ever tighter restrictions on female conduct. And a tragic example of the juxtaposition between the new ideas of sexual freedom in the 18th century and how available they are in theory to women, and yet how difficult it is for them to be put into practice socially, is the tragic story of Jean Hume, the brilliant only daughter of Henry Hume, Lord Kaimes, one of the leading thinkers of the Enlightenment. That is Lord Kaimes. In the early 1760s, when she was only 16 or 17, and had just been married off by her parents to an army officer, Jean Hume embarked on a passionate affair with James Boswell. He was single, she was married. And when he began to get pangs of conscience about whether this was really a good thing and whether it was okay for him to meet with Lord Kaimes and talk about philosophy with him and yet carry on an affair behind his back with his daughter, she, Jean, argued to him that they did nothing wrong. Here's an extract from Boswell's diary. She was a subtle philosopher. She said, "I love my husband as a husband, and you as a lover, each in his own sphere. I perform for him all the duties of a good wife. With you, I give myself up to delicious pleasures. We keep our secret. Nature has so made me that I shall never bear children. So, no one suffers because of our loves. My conscience does not reproach me, and I am sure that God cannot be offended either." A decade later, when her husband divorced her for another affair, she declared, likewise, that she hoped that God Almighty would not punish her for the only crime she could charge herself with, which was the gratification of those passions which he himself had implanted in her nature. Those are exactly the same kinds of arguments that are being used to argue for male sexual liberty from this point onwards. But her father, the great scholar, the great moral authority, took the conventional view that adultery in a man, quote, may happen occasionally with little or no alienation of affection, but in a woman was unpardonable. After his daughter's divorce, he and Lady Kaimes exiled her to France, and they never saw her again. So one of the chief effects of the first sexual revolution is that it lays the foundation for Victorian prudery and repression and the whole complex of desexualization of women that we can see developing so clearly after 1800.